I grew up feeling invisible in my own family. How being overshadowed by my brother, betrayed by friends, and constantly compared made me doubt myself for years. From heartbreak in college to learning to trust again, facing my parents about their favoritism, and finally finding a life where I could stand on my own and be seen for who I really am. I always felt like I was living in someone else's shadow. My brother got all the attention, my friends sometimes let me down, and even my parents didn't always see me for who I really was. This is the story of how I faced betrayal, heartbreak, and favoritism, learned to trust myself, and finally carved out a life where I could be truly seen and heard. I remember the first time I realized my life wouldn't be simple. I was 7, sitting at the small kitchen table with a plate of pancakes that had gone cold because I wasn't hungry anymore. My older brother, Ethan, had just finished a stack of 3 tall pancakes, grinning at Mom's praise. "Good job, Ethan," she said, ruffling his hair. Then she looked at me with a sigh, saying, "Why can't you be more like your brother?" It was a phrase that would haunt me for years. From that moment on, everything I did was measured against him, his grades, his talents, his popularity, his every little success. I tried to compete, tried to shine in my own way, but it felt like no matter what I accomplished, it was never enough. My wins were small, fleeting, and often overshadowed by Ethan's achievements. School became another battlefield. Ethan was outgoing, charismatic, and effortlessly liked by everyone. I was quiet, shy, and overly sensitive, traits that often made me an easy target for teasing. He never intended to hurt me, but his ease in social situations and constant praise from teachers made me feel invisible. Whenever I spoke up in class or got a good grade, Mom would often shrug, saying, "Well, Ethan always does better," as if my effort didn't matter. The tension at home wasn't just about Mom's comparisons. Dad was distant, buried in his work, and rarely noticed the emotional currents running between us. He would smile politely, say a few words of encouragement to Ethan, and then retreat to his office. I learned early on that if I wanted validation, I would have to fight for it myself. I spent a lot of time alone, observing the dynamics around me. I watched how Ethan moved through the world with confidence and how my parents treated him as though he were flawless. Meanwhile, I tried to find spaces where I could be myself without constant judgment. Sometimes it was a hidden corner in the library, sometimes it was the small attic above the garage where I would draw, write stories, or simply daydream. Yet even in those quiet moments, the tension followed me. Ethan, in his good-natured way, often teased me. "You're too slow," he would say. "You're too sensitive." At first, I would cry and run to my room, but over time I learned to swallow the tears, to mask the hurt with a forced smile or a nod. I wanted so badly to be seen, to be recognized, but it felt like I existed in Ethan's shadow. School life mirrored home life. Teachers praised Ethan constantly, highlighting his contributions and ignoring mine. Classmates gravitated toward him because of his humor and charisma, while I was often left on the periphery. I tried joining clubs, sports, and activities to prove myself, but no matter what I did, the comparisons followed. If I scored well on a test, someone would remark, "Yeah, but Ethan got a perfect score." Even friends, though they didn't mean harm, would unconsciously measure me against him. By the time I was 10, I had developed a complicated mix of admiration and resentment toward my brother. I admired his confidence, his social skills, and the way he could make everyone laugh. But I resented the way Mom and Dad seemed to elevate him above me in every possible way. I resented the way he didn't notice the struggles I was quietly enduring. I resented the constant comparisons that made me feel inadequate, no matter how hard I tried. The first real blow came when we both auditioned for the school play. I had prepared for weeks, memorized my lines, and worked tirelessly on my performance. Ethan, true to form, breezed through his lines with natural charm. When the cast list was posted, Ethan had a leading role. I was given a minor part, a few lines in the background. Mom clapped her hands in delight, praising Ethan as though he were the star of the universe. "I knew you'd do well," she said. I forced a smile, hiding the sting behind practiced composure. It was in that moment I realized something fundamental. Life wasn't fair, at least not in my family. I understood, in that instant, that if I wanted recognition, I couldn't rely on anyone to give it to me. I had to fight for it, to carve out a space where my accomplishments mattered. And I also learned something darker, that the jealousy simmering inside me, though uncomfortable, was real, and it could shape my actions if I wasn't careful. From that day on, I began to develop strategies. I became meticulous in school, quietly working behind the scenes to ensure I was competent, intelligent, and capable. I avoided direct competition with Ethan when possible, instead focusing on areas where I could shine without triggering comparisons. I wrote stories, drew, and created things that were uniquely mine, small victories that no one could take away. At home, I learned to navigate the emotional minefield. I smiled when Ethan was praised, even when it hurt. I congratulated him on successes, while quietly feeling the sting of neglect. I learned to hold my emotions close, to avoid giving mom or dad any reason to see me as weak or insufficient. It was a survival skill, one that would serve me well in later years, though it came at the cost of my emotional openness. By the time I reached adolescence, the sibling rivalry had deepened, shaped not only by comparisons, but by more subtle manipulations. I caught glimpses of favoritism in ways I hadn't noticed as a child. The way mom would prepare Ethan's favorite meals first, or how dad would remember details about his schedule but forget mine. Every small instance reinforced the pattern. I was secondary, always in the shadow of someone else. Yet, amidst the tension and rivalry, I also discovered resilience. I learned that I could take care of myself, that my worth didn't depend solely on recognition from family or peers. I discovered that small victories mattered. Writing a short story that won a school contest, acing a difficult test, or receiving praise from a teacher who saw me for who I truly was. These moments became my lifeline, proof that I could exist, succeed, and grow on my own terms. Looking back, those early years shaped the person I would become. They taught me vigilance, self-reliance, and the need to protect my emotional well-being. They also left scars, the lingering sense of inadequacy, the difficulty trusting that recognition would come without struggle, and the tendency to measure my worth against others. But they also forged resilience, creativity, and a quiet determination that would guide me through the trials ahead. And as I grew older, I began to realize a crucial truth. My life would not be defined by comparisons, favoritism, or sibling rivalry. It would be defined by my choices, my growth, and the courage to carve out a space where I could truly belong, a place where my voice, my accomplishments, and my heart would matter on their own terms. By the time I hit my teenage years, the pressure at home had intensified. What had once been subtle comparisons became constant evaluations of my worth. Ethan seemed to thrive effortlessly. His grades continued to impress. He had a natural ease with friends, and mom's attention followed him wherever he went. I, on the other hand, felt like I was always falling behind, never quite measuring up, no matter how hard I worked. High school amplified everything. Classes were harder, social dynamics more complicated, and the stakes higher. Teachers who had once ignored me now seemed indifferent, while Ethan was praised at every opportunity. I tried to assert myself, joining clubs, volunteering for leadership roles, and participating in competitions, but the praise never felt genuine, never fully mine. Even when I succeeded, the acknowledgement was often half-hearted, as if my achievements were merely expected. Social life was no easier. Teens can be cruel, and I had learned early that the best way to survive was to stay under the radar. I had friends, yes, but my insecurities made me hesitant to fully trust them. I constantly worried about judgment, about being compared to Ethan, or about someone noticing that I wasn't enough. Parties, group projects, and casual hangouts all carried a weight that made me anxious, and I often felt like an outsider even among friends. Ethan, for his part, remained blissfully unaware of my inner turmoil. He was friendly, even protective at times, but his ease in life often made me feel smaller by contrast. Every success he achieved was a reminder of what I lacked, and every praise he received from mom or teachers reinforced the unfairness of it all. I loved my brother, but the envy I felt was impossible to ignore. It was a mix of admiration and resentment that gnawed at me constantly. At school, I faced another challenge, the subtle manipulations of peers who sensed my insecurities. Rumors spread about me, sometimes instigated by classmates who wanted to elevate themselves by putting me down. I learned to navigate these social minefields carefully, smiling, nodding, and avoiding confrontation whenever possible. It was exhausting, and it often left me feeling lonely, even when I was surrounded by people. Academically, I threw myself into my studies. I discovered a love for writing and literature, a refuge where I could express my thoughts and feelings freely. I started keeping a journal, pouring my emotions into it late at night after everyone else had gone to bed. Writing became my escape, my safe space, and a way to validate myself when no one else seemed to notice. Despite my efforts, the comparisons at home never ceased. I remember one evening vividly. Ethan had won a regional science competition, and mom and dad were ecstatic. I had received an honorable mention in a writing contest the same week, but it was barely acknowledged. "It's good, I guess," mom said, distractedly flipping through a magazine. My chest tightened, and I realized that no matter what I accomplished, it would always be secondary to Ethan's achievements. This dynamic shaped how I approached relationships outside the family as well. I found it difficult to trust that anyone could value me without judgment. Friends' praise felt tentative, teachers' compliments seemed conditional, and even my own accomplishments were always measured against some higher standard. I began to internalize the idea that my worth was always relative, never absolute. Teenage years also brought the first hints of rebellion. I started testing boundaries at home, small acts of defiance designed to assert some control over my life. I stayed out late under the pretense of studying at a friend's house, experimented with hairstyles and clothes that I knew would irritate my parents, and questioned household rules. Each act was met with criticism or disappointment, reinforcing the tension but also giving me a sense of autonomy I desperately craved. Friendship became both a refuge and a challenge. I had a close-knit group of peers who supported me, yet even among them, I sometimes felt the sting of comparison. One friend would compliment Ethan or his talents, and I couldn't help but shrink in response. I had to consciously remind myself that my value wasn't diminished by someone else's success. It was a lesson I would continue to relearn throughout my life. Romantic interests began to emerge during these years as well, but they were fraught with insecurities. I found it difficult to trust that someone could like me genuinely, without comparing me to Ethan or others. I became guarded, cautious in opening my heart, and often misinterpreted innocent remarks as criticism. My teenage years were a delicate balancing act between vulnerability and self-protection, a dance I wasn't fully equipped to navigate yet. Despite the struggles, there were moments of triumph. Winning a writing award at school, being chosen to lead a group project, or receiving praise from a teacher who genuinely appreciated my effort. These moments reminded me that I was capable and deserving of recognition. They became anchor points, guiding me through the emotional turbulence and giving me glimpses of the confidence I would one day fully claim. By the end of high school, I had learned a hard truth. Life wouldn't always be fair, and people I loved might never fully see or appreciate my worth. But I had also learned resilience. I had developed coping strategies, cultivated talents that were uniquely mine, and discovered the importance of emotional self-reliance. I knew that my path would be challenging, but I was determined to carve out a life where I could thrive, independent of favoritism, jealousy, or manipulation. Those teenage years left a lasting impression. They shaped how I approached relationships, work, and personal growth. They taught me the painful lesson that validation from others could be fleeting, conditional, or biased, but they also taught me the invaluable skill of self-validation, the ability to recognize my own worth, and the courage to pursue my goals despite the obstacles. And as I prepared to leave for college, I carried these lessons with me. The pain of comparison, the sting of favoritism, the challenges of trust, and alongside them, the resilience, creativity, and determination that would define my adult life. I was no longer just a child living in Ethan's shadow. I was someone beginning to step into my own light, ready to face the complexities of adulthood with courage and awareness. College was supposed to be my fresh start. I had envisioned it as a place where no one knew me, where I could exist without the constant comparison to Ethan, where every achievement would be entirely my own. And for a while, it felt like I was right. I joined clubs, met new friends, and threw myself into my writing more than ever before. But adulthood, I quickly learned, had its own set of challenges, ones that were far more complicated than teenage gossip or schoolyard rivalries. My first year at university was a whirlwind of late-night study sessions, shared laughter with new friends, and the thrill of independence. I loved decorating my small dorm room, making it my safe haven away from the pressure of home. I even started dating a fellow literature major named Ryan, who seemed to understand my passion for writing and my quiet, introverted nature. For the first time, I felt genuinely seen. Ryan encouraged me, read my drafts, and even skipped his own classes to walk me to mine. We shared long talks about our dreams, books we loved, and the kind of life we wanted. I thought I had found someone who valued me for who I was, not for how I compared to anyone else. But the illusion didn't last. Halfway through my second year, I learned that Ryan had been talking to another girl in his creative writing workshop. Not just talking, flirting, confiding in her, and as I eventually discovered, spending nights with her when I thought he was studying. The betrayal cut deeper than I expected. It wasn't just that he had cheated. It was that he had made me believe I was safe, valued, and irreplaceable, only to show me I wasn't. When I confronted him, he had the audacity to tell me, "She just understands me in a way you don't." That sentence echoed in my head for months. It was as if every insecurity from my childhood had been condensed into one brutal moment. I was back to being not enough. The heartbreak lingered, but it wasn't the only challenge I faced that year. College friendships, as I discovered, could be just as complicated as high school ones. My roommate, someone I had trusted completely, began spreading subtle rumors about me. At first, I didn't notice. People just seemed a little colder, a little more distant. Then I heard through a mutual friend that she'd been telling others I was manipulative, jealous, and desperate for attention. It was such a calculated attack that I almost admired the effort, almost. Confronting her only made things worse. She laughed, told me I was overreacting, and reminded me that she was friends with nearly everyone in our social circle. I was left isolated in a way that felt eerily familiar, and the weight of being misunderstood crushed me more than I wanted to admit. Through it all, I clung to my writing. If there was one thing I could control, it was my words. I started working on a series of short stories that explored themes of betrayal, trust, and self-worth. My professors noticed my dedication and encouraged me to submit to literary magazines. When I got my first acceptance letter, I cried alone in my room, partly from joy, partly from exhaustion. But as much as writing sustained me, real life demanded resilience beyond the page. Money was tight, and I had to juggle part-time jobs to afford tuition and rent. I worked in a cafe during the day, tutored high school students at night, and often stayed up until dawn finishing essays. It was exhausting, but it also taught me something I hadn't fully learned before. I was capable of surviving without anyone else's approval. By the time I graduated, I had weathered enough storms to feel older than my years. But I wasn't bitter, at least not entirely. I had learned to be careful with my trust, to watch for red flags before giving someone the power to hurt me. I understood that betrayal could come from the people closest to you, and that sometimes self-preservation meant walking away without an explanation. After graduation, I moved to a new city, determined to start over yet again. I found a small apartment, took a job as an editorial assistant, and began building a life that felt entirely my own. The city was loud, chaotic, and endlessly alive, a stark contrast to the small-town shadows of my childhood. But even in this new chapter, echoes of the past followed me. I met people who reminded me of my old friends, old enemies, even Ethan. Some were kind, others calculating. I was better at telling them apart now, but I still had moments of doubt. I still wondered, sometimes, if I was truly enough, or if I was just playing a part in someone else's story. The turning point came one rainy evening when I ran into Ryan again. He was in the city for a work conference, and we bumped into each other outside a bookstore. My first instinct was to avoid him, but he caught my eye and smiled like no time had passed. We talked briefly, small talk about jobs, mutual friends, and the weather, but as he spoke, I realized something. I didn't feel the old ache anymore. There was no longing, no sting of rejection. Just clarity. He was part of my past, a chapter one had outgrown. That night, I went home and opened my journal. I wrote for hours, not about Ryan specifically, but about growth, about the quiet ways we heal, the small victories no one else sees, the strength it takes to keep going when you feel unseen. I realized that the betrayals I had endured hadn't defined me. They had shaped me. And for the first time in years, I felt something close to peace. I still had questions about my worth, still had moments of self-doubt, but I also had proof, tangible, undeniable proof, that I could survive heartbreak, betrayal, and loneliness, and still find ways to build a life worth living. The next phase of my life would bring its own challenges, but I was ready. Because I had learned the hardest lesson of all. Even when no one else sees your value, you can, and must, see it for yourself. By the time I had settled into my first full-time job, I thought I had left the worst of my childhood and college struggles behind. I had an editorial position at a reputable publishing house, a small but cozy apartment in the city, and friends who genuinely cared for me. I felt like I was finally building a life that was truly mine. Yet, the past has a way of catching up, and for me, that past was never just memories, it was family. Despite the physical distance from my hometown, I remained tethered to the invisible strings of favoritism and comparison, woven by my parents and most painfully by Ethan. Phone calls from home were brief, polite, but they always carried an undercurrent of judgment. Ethan just got promoted again, Mom would say casually. Are you sure you're making the right career choices? It would have been easy to ignore, but years of conditioning had left a subtle wound that flared up every time my accomplishments were minimized. I began questioning myself, wondering if I was doing enough or if I was, somehow, inadequate despite all my successes. The tension escalated during a visit home for the holidays. I had been promoted to assistant editor at my company, a milestone I was proud of. I expected acknowledgement from my family, or at least neutrality, but what I got instead was indifference. Mom barely asked about my work, while Ethan recounted every detail of his own achievements in lavish, self-assured narratives. It was then I realized I couldn't keep letting their comparisons define me. I couldn't allow myself to shrink or feel invisible while my life unfolded. Something had to change. The confrontation began subtly. During a quiet dinner one evening, I mentioned a recent professional accomplishment. I had managed a team project that successfully launched a high-profile publication. Mom offered a lukewarm "that's nice," barely looking up from her plate. Ethan, in his usual charming way, responded with a self-congratulatory story about a recent corporate award he had received. I felt my temper rise, a familiar mix of frustration and suppressed resentment. I took a deep breath and decided, for the first time, to voice what had been simmering inside me for decades. I calmly explained how their favoritism had shaped my childhood and young adulthood, how Ethan's successes were always celebrated while mine were overlooked, and how the constant comparisons had affected my self-esteem and confidence. The room went silent. My parents exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly unprepared for this confrontation. Ethan's confident smile faltered, and for the first time, I saw uncertainty in his eyes. I realized that my voice, the one that had been silenced or overshadowed for so long, now carried weight. "I'm proud of my accomplishments," I said, keeping my tone firm but measured. "And I need you to recognize that they matter, not just Ethan's. I've worked hard, and I deserve acknowledgement, just like he does." Mom looked down at her hands, and Dad shifted in his chair, muttering something about never realizing it had affected me so much. Ethan tried to interject, but I gently held up a hand. "I'm not here to argue or compete. I just want to be seen for who I am, not as a comparison or a shadow of someone else." The tension in the room didn't disappear entirely, but something had shifted. There was a crack in the familiar dynamics, a recognition that the old patterns of favoritism and comparison could no longer hold. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, a quiet sense of liberation that I hadn't anticipated. Returning to the city after that visit, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I immersed myself in my work, taking on challenging projects and mentoring junior colleagues. I realized that while familial recognition was valuable, it was not the only measure of my worth. I began celebrating my own achievements, journaling about milestones, and sharing successes with friends who genuinely cared. Romantically, I had learned to navigate relationships with more awareness. Past betrayals and insecurities no longer dictated my choices. I approached dating with honesty, setting clear boundaries, and choosing partners who respected me and valued my autonomy. For the first time, I felt confident in my ability to cultivate meaningful, supportive relationships. But life, of course, wasn't without complications. Ethan, despite the subtle crack in his confidence during our confrontation, continued to thrive. He called occasionally, sometimes to share achievements, sometimes just to maintain the familiar patterns of conversation. I responded politely, but I no longer felt the need to compete. I had learned that my success and happiness did not depend on overshadowing him or being overshadowed. This period of adult life also brought unexpected lessons in empathy. I began to understand that favoritism and comparison were not always malicious. Often, they were the result of parental anxieties, societal pressures, or unconscious patterns. While this didn't excuse the emotional impact on me, it helped me cultivate a sense of compassion that softened some of the resentment I had carried for years. Professionally, I eventually faced another kind of challenge: office politics and manipulations that echoed the dynamics of my childhood. Colleagues who sought to take credit for my work, supervisors who undervalued my contributions, and subtle undermining in meetings reminded me that the world beyond family could be just as challenging emotionally. But I approached these situations with the resilience I had built over decades, addressing conflicts directly, documenting achievements, and maintaining professional integrity. By the time I reached my late 20s, I had created a life that felt authentically mine. I had boundaries with my family, independence in my career, and relationships rooted in mutual respect. The confrontation at home had been pivotal, a reminder that reclaiming one's voice, asserting boundaries, and demanding recognition were not acts of defiance, but acts of survival and self-respect. Looking back, I realized that adulthood was a constant negotiation between past patterns and present choices. I couldn't erase childhood experiences, but I could choose how they influenced my life. I could step into spaces that honored my achievements, protect my emotional well-being, and cultivate relationships that nourished rather than diminished me. And in that realization, I found not only strength, but clarity. Life was no longer a series of comparisons or competitions. It was my story, with challenges, setbacks, triumphs, and growth, and for the first time, I felt empowered to write it exactly the way I wanted. By my late 20s, I had carved out a professional life that I was proud of, and yet, my personal life remained a delicate landscape of caution and hope. Years of betrayal, favoritism, and constant comparison had left me wary of trusting others fully. I approached romantic relationships with both optimism and hesitation, aware that vulnerability could either lead to intimacy or heartbreak. It was during this period that I met Daniel. He was unlike anyone I had ever dated, quiet, thoughtful, and deeply attentive. He noticed the small details about me that others overlooked. The way I sipped my coffee, the books I highlighted obsessively, the way my eyes lit up when discussing a topic I was passionate about. For the first time, I felt seen not as a reflection of someone else's expectations, but as an individual with my own desires, fears, and dreams. The early months were intoxicating. We spent hours walking through city streets, sharing stories from our childhoods, laughing about absurd situations, and confiding in each other about insecurities we had kept hidden from the world. I began to feel that maybe, just maybe, I could allow myself to trust someone completely. Yet, old habits die hard. Every time Daniel was delayed in responding to a text or seemed distant, I found myself spiraling into doubt. I questioned whether I was enough, whether he would eventually compare me to someone else, or whether I would somehow disappoint him, as I had felt I disappointed my family for so long. It was a struggle to separate past conditioning from present reality. Daniel, fortunately, was patient. He never dismissed my feelings, never belittled my fears, and often reassured me with quiet, steady presence. He helped me see that trust was built gradually, not demanded, and that vulnerability was not weakness but courage. Slowly, I began to lower the walls I had erected around my heart, allowing myself to experience intimacy without constant fear of betrayal. However, life has a way of testing even the strongest foundations. Daniel's career required frequent travel, and during one particularly long trip, I encountered my first real test of patience and faith. The distance rekindled insecurities I thought I had outgrown. I wondered whether he was making the right choices, whether his attention was still on me, or whether I would be left feeling abandoned once again. It was during this time that I leaned heavily on my writing. My journal became a mirror for my fears and a space for reflection. I wrote letters to Daniel, unsent, expressing every doubt, every worry, every yearning for reassurance. Then I read them aloud to myself, not as a plea for attention, but as a way to confront my emotions honestly. When Daniel returned, I was nervous but determined to communicate openly. I shared my insecurities, my fears of abandonment, and my struggles with trust. His response was simple yet profound. "I'm here and I see you. I'm not going anywhere." Those words, though few, carried more weight than any grand gesture could. For the first time, I realized that trust was not about constant proof but about consistency, respect, and shared commitment. As the relationship deepened, I began to recognize patterns in myself that mirrored my childhood struggles. I noticed how easy it was for me to slip into comparison, to measure my worth against others, or to internalize criticism too readily. Yet, Daniel's patience and encouragement allowed me to confront these tendencies without shame. I learned to celebrate my own successes, both big and small, and to recognize that my value was inherent, not conditional. Family dynamics continued to play a role, of course. When Daniel met my parents, I worried about old patterns resurfacing, comparisons, subtle judgments, or favoritism toward Ethan. The first dinner with them was tense. Mom praised Ethan's accomplishments yet again, but I held my ground. I spoke confidently about my career, my writing, and my goals, refusing to shrink in the shadow of anyone else. To my surprise, Daniel's calm support made the interaction bearable. I realized that having a partner who respected my boundaries was just as important as any family acknowledgement I had sought for years. Through these experiences, I also began mentoring younger colleagues and friends, sharing lessons about self-worth, trust, and emotional resilience. Guiding others through struggles similar to mine reinforced my own growth and reminded me of how far I had come. I was no longer defined by jealousy, comparison, or fear of inadequacy. I was defined by my choices, my resilience, and my courage to engage authentically with life. The most profound lesson of this period was the understanding that relationships, like life, require balance. I couldn't rely entirely on others for validation, nor could I expect perfection from myself or anyone else. Trust had to be earned gradually, boundaries had to be respected, and emotional growth was ongoing. Every challenge Daniel and I faced, misunderstandings, distance, and the inevitable stresses of adulthood, became an opportunity to strengthen our connection and fortify my sense of self. By the time our relationship reached its third year, I felt a profound sense of stability and emotional maturity. I was still the person who had grown up in the shadow of comparison, but now I was someone who had faced betrayal, heartbreak, and doubt, and emerged stronger, wiser, and more self-aware. I had learned to navigate the complexities of love, to trust without losing myself, and to embrace the vulnerability that comes with deep connection. In retrospect, I could see that my romantic journey was as much about self-discovery as it was about companionship. Through Daniel, I learned to confront fears, set boundaries, and cherish intimacy without letting past wounds dictate my present. The lessons of my childhood, rivalry, favoritism, and self-doubt, were not erased, but they were transformed. They became tools for growth rather than chains that held me back. And as I stood at the threshold of a new chapter, I understood something fundamental. Love is not a destination but a journey. It requires courage, patience, and a willingness to face oneself honestly. It is both fragile and resilient, demanding vulnerability while offering profound rewards. Most importantly, it taught me that I was worthy of love, recognition, and respect, not because of how I compared to anyone else, but because of who I am. Life, I realized, has a way of forcing us to face the very shadows we thought we had left behind. Even with a supportive partner, a fulfilling career, and a newfound sense of self-worth, there were still unresolved tensions, especially with my family. The confrontation I had years earlier had opened a crack in the old dynamics, but the patterns of favoritism and jealousy had not completely disappeared. It all came to a head during another family gathering, this time for my father's 60th birthday. I had returned home confident, prepared to assert my presence and celebrate not only my father's milestone but also the life I had carved out for myself. But as soon as I stepped through the door, I could feel the familiar weight of comparison settling over me. Mom was bustling around, praising Ethan's latest promotion yet again, and even Dad, who had once seemed distant, was nodding along with admiration. I realized in that moment that it wasn't enough to confront them once. I had to confront the entire dynamic. I couldn't let decades of emotional patterns continue to dictate my sense of self. I took a deep breath, steadied my nerves, and decided to speak with clarity, courage, and honesty. "Mom, Dad," I began, my voice calm but firm, "I need to say something important. I've worked hard, and I've built a life that I am proud of. I've faced challenges, failures, and betrayals, yet I have grown stronger because of them. But I cannot keep living under the shadow of constant comparisons. Ethan's accomplishments do not diminish mine, and my successes deserve recognition on their own merit." The room went silent. Ethan, who had been chatting casually, froze mid-sentence, his usual confident demeanor faltering. My parents exchanged glances, caught off guard by the directness of my words. "I am not competing with Ethan," I continued. "I am not here to seek approval or validation from anyone else. I am here to ask that you acknowledge me for who I am, not as a reflection of someone else. I love my brother, and I am proud of his successes, but I also deserve the same respect and recognition." There was a long pause. Mom's eyes glistened, and I could see the weight of realization settling over her. Dad leaned back in his chair, clearly unprepared but attentive. Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it, unsure of what to say. For the first time in years, the air in the room felt different. The unspoken patterns of favoritism and comparison, which had haunted me since childhood, had been addressed openly. I felt a sense of liberation, a lightness that I hadn't experienced in decades. Speaking my truth aloud was not just an act of courage. It was a reclamation of my voice, my presence, and my worth. Over the following days, conversations with my parents shifted subtly, but significantly. They began asking more about my life, my work, and my accomplishments, not in passing, not as a comparison to Ethan, but out of genuine interest. The dynamic with Ethan also evolved. He seemed to respect my boundaries more, recognizing that my achievements were separate and equally valuable. The sibling rivalry that had defined so much of my early life began to fade into mutual understanding. This period also marked a turning point in my relationship with Daniel. We had weathered the challenges of distance, insecurities, and trust, and now we faced the future together with greater confidence. The experiences I had endured, betrayal, favoritism, and constant comparison, had equipped me to build a relationship grounded in honesty, respect, and emotional depth. Daniel and I began discussing long-term goals, shared dreams, and the possibility of building a family together. Professionally, I continued to grow. My editorial work expanded into leadership roles, mentoring programs, and creative projects that allowed me to shape narratives in ways I had once only dreamed of. I took on speaking engagements, workshops, and writing collaborations, using my story as an example of resilience and personal growth. Every step forward reinforced the truth I had come to embrace. My worth was inherent, my accomplishments mattered, and my voice deserved to be heard. The culmination of these experiences brought me to a place of profound self-awareness. I understood that life would always present challenges, betrayal, jealousy, favoritism, and doubt, but that these challenges were not insurmountable. They were opportunities for growth, for establishing boundaries, and for asserting one's presence in a world that often seeks to diminish it. Looking back, I saw the continuity between childhood struggles, teenage insecurities, early adult betrayals, and present triumphs. Each chapter had contributed to the person I had become, resilient, self-aware, empathetic, and capable of both loving and protecting myself. I had learned to navigate complex relationships, confront long-standing emotional patterns, and cultivate a sense of identity independent of external validation. By the end of that year, I felt a sense of completeness I had never known. The confrontation with my family had not erased past pain, but it had transformed it into a foundation for emotional maturity. I had reclaimed my voice, established boundaries, and cultivated relationships, both familial and romantic, that honored my growth. And for the first time, I could reflect on my journey without resentment or regret. I could see my life as a series of challenges overcome, lessons learned, and triumphs earned. I understood that the shadows of the past would always be a part of me, but they no longer defined me. They were proof of endurance, courage, and the capacity for growth. In the quiet moments, when I sat alone with my journal or walked through the city streets with Daniel by my side, I often marveled at how far I had come. The child who once felt invisible, the teenager who feared comparison, the young adult who had been betrayed and doubted, all of them had contributed to the adult I had become, strong, self-assured, and capable of facing life's challenges with grace. And as I looked forward to the future, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. My story was mine to write, unshaped by favoritism, rivalry, or the expectations of others. It was a story of resilience, love, growth, and triumph, a story I was proud to call my own. The years following the confrontation with my family were filled with quiet victories and subtle, but meaningful shifts. The air between us became lighter, less heavy with comparison and unspoken expectations. My parents began asking about my career with genuine interest, not as a benchmark against Ethan's achievements. Ethan himself grew more considerate, often reaching out to celebrate my successes without overshadowing them. For the first time, family gatherings were no longer fraught with tension. Birthdays, holidays, and casual dinners became opportunities for connection rather than arenas of rivalry. I noticed the change most in my mother, whose eyes, once critical and distracted, now often reflected pride in me. It was not constant, and there were still occasional moments where old patterns threatened to resurface, but they no longer had power over my self-worth. Daniel and I continued to build our life together, navigating adulthood as partners, allies, and friends. We celebrated milestones, a promotion, a published article, a completed project, not as trophies for others to judge, but as personal achievements we could savor together. The trust we had nurtured over years became a cornerstone of our relationship, providing stability even when challenges arose. I also deepened my commitment to personal growth. I sought therapy for the lingering effects of childhood favoritism and past betrayals, learning to identify triggers, respond with self-compassion, and communicate assertively. Journaling remained a refuge, a private space to process emotions, reflect on achievements, and chart the trajectory of my life. Writing, once a solitary escape, had become both a tool for self-discovery and a bridge to others through mentorship, workshops, and publications. One evening, as Daniel and I sat together in our apartment, I reflected on the long journey that had brought me here. I thought of the child who felt invisible in her own home, the teenager weighed down by comparison, the young adult betrayed and doubting her worth. Each stage of struggle had been painful, yes, but it had also been formative. Without those challenges, I would not have developed the resilience, empathy, and self-awareness that define me now. The most surprising lesson of all was forgiveness, not as an obligation, but as a choice. I forgave my parents for their unconscious favoritism, not to erase the past, but to release the grip it had on my present. I forgave Ethan, not because he had caused pain intentionally, but because holding resentment would have only tethered me to a version of myself defined by jealousy and inadequacy. Forgiveness became a tool of liberation, a way to reclaim peace without condoning past hurt. As reconciliation deepened, I began to reconnect with extended family and childhood friends. Relationships that had once been strained by envy, misunderstanding, or distance began to mend. I realized that maintaining boundaries, asserting my voice, and valuing myself did not preclude connection. In fact, it enhanced it. People responded to authenticity, to courage, and to the refusal to allow past patterns to dictate present interactions. Professionally, I continued to flourish. The editorial projects I managed were increasingly impactful, the articles I wrote gained recognition, and the mentoring relationships I nurtured became deeply rewarding. I was no longer seeking validation through external approval. Instead, I measured success by impact, growth, and integrity. Each achievement was a quiet affirmation that I could thrive on my own terms. Romantically, Daniel and I took steps toward a long-term commitment. We discussed marriage, financial goals, and future family plans with an openness that reflected both trust and mutual respect. The emotional scars from past betrayals and insecurities remained as reminders of resilience, not limitations. Together, we navigated life's uncertainties with the confidence that we were partners in every sense, emotionally, practically, and spiritually. Looking back over the arc of my life, I could see a clear progression, from a child overshadowed and silenced, to a teenager navigating envy and social pressures, to a young adult facing betrayal, and finally to an adult claiming autonomy, respect, and love. The journey had not been linear, nor had it been easy, but it had been entirely transformative. I also recognized the subtle victories, moments that once seemed small but were, in fact, monumental. Speaking my truth to my family, asserting boundaries in my relationship with Ethan, nurturing a romance built on trust, and celebrating my professional accomplishments, these were the milestones that defined my journey. Each step was a testament to resilience, self-awareness, and the refusal to be diminished by comparison or past pain. By the time I reached my early 30s, I had fully embraced the life I had fought to create. Family gatherings were warm rather than tense, romantic relationships were fulfilling rather than fraught, and my career was both challenging and deeply satisfying. I had cultivated friendships grounded in mutual respect and honesty, relationships that nourished rather than drained me, and a sense of self that was steadfast and resilient. In moments of solitude, I often returned to my journal, reflecting on the journey and the lessons learned. I wrote about triumphs, setbacks, love, loss, and growth. I revisited old entries, reading the words of the child, teenager, and young adult I had once been. I felt pride in the person I had become, a person who had faced the shadows of favoritism, betrayal, and doubt, and emerged stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. The ultimate realization, the one that brought the deepest peace, was this: life is neither fair nor predictable, but it is navigable. Challenges will arise, people will disappoint, and insecurities will surface, but these do not define us. What defines us is how we respond, how we assert our worth, and how we cultivate growth, love, and resilience in the face of adversity. And so, I close the chapter on the past with gratitude rather than regret, with clarity rather than confusion, and with courage rather than fear. My story, once overshadowed, doubted, and silenced, had become a testament to perseverance, self-discovery, and the enduring power of hope. I had learned that no matter the betrayals, comparisons, or favoritism endured, I could carve out a life defined by authenticity, love, and fulfillment. And in that knowledge, I finally felt free to live fully, to love deeply, and to embrace every moment as mine, entirely and unequivocally.